today I'd like to focus on analogy component, analogy making component that was probably one of the first in developing the theory of analogy. I mean structure mapping, and I would like to consider the process, the mechanism of mapping relational structures, but across various analogy tasks. But then I will move to more general topic of, because for me, relational structure mapping is just a case of a more general phenomenon, which is structure representation or relational structure representation. And I will try to show some evidence that it's quite a general mechanism that goes beyond analogy and is important also for other categories of complex cognition processes. So why doesn't it work? Okay. So just to remind, probably one of the key concepts in analogy making, relational structure mapping or structure mapping started from the seminal and very influential theory of Dedre Gentner, that it's the key process in making analogy is to revealing the hidden structure of relations between object situations, elements into analogs, and matching or aligning corresponding elements together. So those typically we have one analog that is more familiar. We have broader knowledge about it, and the other analog that is novel, less familiar. So we build a representation of relational structure in one of the analogs. We try to, it depends on the specific version of the model, but we try to find corresponding elements for each element of our relational structure, but typically some elements in the familiar analog cannot be matched. We cannot find corresponding elements. So we use our knowledge, our previous experience to infer what the missing elements in the other analog should be. It's relational transfer or analogical transfer. And Dedre Gentner assumed a number of regularities in our mapping, for example, that people tend to map one element to one element or one relation to one relation between analogs, and that people tend to achieve global mapping. So the most high order structure that can describe our analogy. What cannot be aligned, differences that are specific for a given situation, only one analog, and cannot be found or do not apply to another analog, are typically ignored. And there are a number of factors that affect accuracy of structure mapping. For example, the complexity of the structure we try to map. And this is probably one of the most, one of the best researched components of analogy making. There were many computational models that attempted to implement various versions of structure mapping. This is also an illustration how structure mapping, according to this theory, should look like. Picture I borrowed from Gentner and Smith, 2012. So first there is an alignment, some abstract, some representation of elements and relations between them in the base, which is more familiar. analog and in a target. Then we use our knowledge to predict what should be the missing element in the structure of the target. And probably if we are successful, we can abstract some more abstract schema and even learn it and use it in next cases of analogy making. So, and this is a typical analogy task used in most of research. So it's semantically rich, or it has some semantic content. Most of research on mapping used tasks similar to that. So we have here some relation that some person oversees transferring some resource to an object that needs this resource. So either petrol is transferred to the car, or by a man, or a man oversees how water is transferred from the water tank to the grass, which also needs it. So typically in tasks like that, one object is highlighted, and the task is to find the object that corresponds to this highlighted object. But of course, you can also and we did some research with this kind of tasks. But what is more interesting for us are tasks that lack semantic content, that use some formal elements like geometric shapes or symbols or other things like that. And people need to find relations in this material. So you can have a task like this, which I will describe now because I will then I will show a study which utilizes this task. So you have two analogs, a bottom one and a middle one, and I call them analogs, but of course in these formal tasks it's not probably a good terminology, but the middle pattern is constructed by applying some geometric transformations to three shapes of the top pattern. So for example, the trapezium gets rotated and its rim thickens. One of shapes is rotated, its rim changes, and also the color changes, and so on. And the task is to find a pattern of shapes which would be generated with exactly the same unique combinations of transformations from the bottom pattern. So in this version, of course, this task is ambiguous because you can have many alternative correct responses. So typically there is a bunch of responses, and you have to select the correct one, and only one response is correct. So for example, this can be correct response because it contains three shapes that were transformed with exactly the same combinations of transformations. So it's less a typical analogy task, but for us it's useful for several reasons I will describe in a moment. So our team investigated for the last 10 years how cognitive and neuronal mechanisms of relational structure mapping can look like. We use various methods, various tasks, but the general focus was generally the same. After research in 80s, 90s on structure mapping, I think some other aspects of analogy were became more popular, like perceptual aspects of analogy, semantic ones, pragmatic, but in a way we return to these original ideas, but try to research them with new methods that are available now. So I will show 5 studies, which each study is a little bit different from all the other ones, but I hope they will tell a consistent story about mapping, about the mapping process. So the first study will ask the question how the mapping process unfolds in time, how it this process is carried out by our mind by using eye tracking, which allows to more precise insight in what people do when they try to map things together. Especially there are 2 alternatives. We can think about the mapping process as strictly incremental. So the mind may probably start with a very small number of elements, building very tiny initial relational structure, and then proceed by adding consecutive elements to this representation of a structure governing the analogy. But the other option is that the mind can construct either quite huge representation and test whether it's a good guess or it's a probably a good retrieval from memory, or even can allow many parallel representations of the structure to be tested in at the same time. So there are models that assume incremental way, like incremental analogy machine or the LISA model, but also we can find more parallel models like structure mapping engine or ACME. And what's to foretell what we found that the mapping is quite an incremental business. So we asked another question, if it's incremental, whether the way it proceeds is somehow dependent on working memory. We know that analogy performance typically is strongly correlated with working memory, but in this case, we asked whether the way it unfolds is also different between people which have high working memory resources and those that does not have such resources. And surprisingly, we found that there is absolutely no difference. So even people with poor working memory can run the same incremental mapping process as very capacious people. So it was quite a surprising result. So we asked another question: if not the way the mapping proceeds differentiates people with different various levels of cognitive ability, what other features of the mapping process or even of the representation of the mapping can drive the notably strong relationship with working memory or cognitive ability? I will be using such terms as working memory, cognitive ability, fluid intelligence interchangeably because they typically correlate very strongly. So it's more or less the same. Of course, they are not the same cognitive mechanism, but from the perspective of individual differences, they are more or less the same psychometric variable. So we found I think we found such a feature that may drive the relationship between more generally representing relations, representing relational structures and working memory cognitive ability. So the next natural question is, what at the brain level may be associated with processing of relations. Can we find any neural markers of constructing, processing, maintaining, and validating of relational structures? And finally, after all these studies, we came to the conclusion that structure mapping ability is something important, not only for analogy, but also other cognitive functions. So can we distill this ability in some way? Can we develop the task that would mainly measure how well people can map structures? Of course, there are no pure tasks in psychology, but can we design a task that would primarily measure how people represent and map structures? And if we succeed to develop such a task, how it relates to general cognition, general cognitive ability. So these are research questions, and I will now start with the first eye tracking study. This was our task, so you already know what people have to do in these tasks. What was, I think, original about this task was that we manipulated. So you know that people had to identify a number of geometric transformations, but what we did was to manipulate the number of matching transformations in each available response in this task. So the responses varied systematically from very bad responses, which shared, for example, no transformation with the correct response. There were some partial solutions, like, let's say, just one correct transformation out of 7 transformations, or only just two transformations, or there were incorrect responses which were almost correct. So either one transformation was missed, or one transformation was exchanged into an incorrect one, and of course there was all correct transformation options, which was the one to be selected. So we could calculate the metric, which we called relational match, or M, which simply indicated the percentage of transformations, or you can call them trivial or simple relations that the response option shared with the correct option. And while people were analyzing, searching those responses, we recorded their eye gazes. So these are the results. Probably we can start with the bottom figure. It shows that there were several conditions of the task. I don't want to go into it. It was a condition, that the most representative one, which had 4 types of responses. So either very bad ones, where none of transformations were present, where there were 2 correct transformations, all but 1 missing transformation, and of course the correct response. And it is a figure that presents the proportion or share of time devoted to each response option. So how long people fixated on this option relative to other options. So you can see that at the beginning of the task, the task was quite difficult. So it normally took about 60-70 seconds on average to find the correct solution, but some trials lasted even longer than 100 seconds. You can see that at the beginning of the trial, people screened the response options more or less with comparable time, but they gradually moved to the correct option and disengaged from those, at least those two most incorrect options. The almost correct option was not disengaged so much, but you can see that this process was quite a gradual one. So the upper figure shows some summary of this process. So the solid line shows the average relational match of responses attended to in 5-second epochs. So, for example, if a person attended for 3 seconds to the all correct option, and for example, for 2 seconds for known option, which has 0 relational match, that would be around 60, value 60. Okay, so it's weighted average of relational match that people attended during 5-second epochs. We choose those 5-second epochs to achieve less noisy presentation of results. So you can see that there is almost linear increase in relational match that people were analyzing, and we assume that what they looked at more or less corresponds to what they had in mind, because it would be ridiculous if one had, let's say, quite a developed representation of a relation. So, for example, he already knew that 2 shapes have to be transformed with 2 unique sets of transformations, and that person still would be fixating on the known option or just one option. So we thought it is quite a rational assumption that what people looked at more or less described what they had in mind, how much developed representation of a relation they had in mind. So if this assumption is correct, we can see that their representation of the relation increased quite incrementally, quite gradually. With the dashed line, we presented how this representation changed in incorrect trials. So you can see that this linear increase is much less steeper. It's not so much linear. So probably people got stuck at some incorrect option. So it was also a nice result that there were various conditions in this task, about 18 different conditions in complexity, mean relational match of the options, and so on. But it's not important. What is important that when we plotted the total number of fixations in trials of each kind, so we had a number of conditions. So for each condition, we could calculate the average number of fixation people did in the trial. And when we looked at the relational match of the response option selected, of course, the average response match of options that people selected in this very condition, you can see quite a linear and a very strong relationship between the number of fixations and how correct response was selected. So to select the correct or almost correct option, people needed a lot more of fixations than for selecting an incorrect, a very incorrect option. So this is the result pertaining to the difference between it is one of the conditions which is, let's say, the figure for it is most nicely, it's the clearest condition to present. So we compared 33% of people with the lowest working memory capacity measured with 3 working memory tasks, with 33% of people with the highest scores on those tasks. And this is how the relational match of the options they inspected visually increased. There is no difference. Perhaps the dashed line is a little bit below the solid line. So perhaps working memory, low working memory people were perhaps slightly slower than those with high working memory, but eventually they reach the same level of, it's the data for correct trials, of course, but it is not that they guessed correct trials or that they use some less relational heuristics. They simply were able to reach the same level of complexity of the representations they had in mind. So, of course, there are strong differences between high and low working memory capacity people in how they manage in analogies, but it is not because they are not able to construct full-blown relational representations. At least we interpret this data as such. And one reviewer to this paper, I think quite aptly noticed that this task is very formal. It is a geometric task, so the result might be quite specific to such an artificial task. So we replicated this result with another version of the task in which we presented cartoon figures which could move their hands and legs and change the color of their blouse, and they could have or have not the hat on their head, and also in each response there were always 6 transformations, so they didn't differ with the number of transformation. Only some 5 of the response options included incorrect combinations of transformations. So, for example, if some person were to move both legs and hands in the 2 correct, for example, in the 2 correct option, that person moved legs, but instead of hands, the color of its blouse changed, and another 2 cartoons were correct. So we thought this task will be much less demanding on working memory. It is more familiar. Of course, it's still semantically lean, but more natural in a way. And the results were exactly the same. So we had quite a linear, at least in the first 50 seconds, quite a linear build-up of relational representation. In the incorrect trials, which were quite rare in this task because it was much easier than the geometric task, the errors were very rare. there was actually no buildup of relational representations, or either people guessed or they were completely not attending to the task or something like this. Okay, so now we will switch to completely another task, which is no longer an analogy task, but is very useful for investigating simple relations or simple bindings between elements. So probably the simplest form of a relation is a directional binding between two elements. And with this task, you can easily study this form of relations. If the processing of relations in such a complex task as geometric analogies was barely affected by working memory, we asked what specific is in processing relations that would depend on the individual differences in cognitive power. So you can call it fluid intelligence, you can call it working memory, cognitive ability. What is this feature of the relational processing task that drives the emergence of the correlation with cognitive ability? So in a typical transitive reasoning task, which we also use, but we changed it considerably. In a typical transitive reasoning task, you have typically three premises which define the monotonic order between usually four elements, and either you have to write down this order or choose the option that matches this order. So in our task, there were three premises. They defined a monotonic order that A is larger than B, B is larger than C, and C is larger than D. And we asked, for example, in a typical task, you ask, is A larger than D, or D is larger than A? But the study consisted of simplifying the task to see the particular moment when the task stopped correlating with cognitive ability. So the logic was, if we eliminate some feature of the task and it still correlates with cognitive ability, that means this feature was not important for this relationship. But if we eliminate some feature and the correlation disappears, it is probably an important factor driving this correlation. So first, we simplified the complexity of the task. So I call it two-premise variant. So we didn't ask about extreme objects in this monotonic relation, but only two premises had to be integrated to find the correct response. So to know that the circle is larger than the triangle, you only have to notice that the circle is larger than the square and the triangle is smaller than the square. So you can ignore the middle premise. It's still correlated with cognitive ability, so we simplified the task even more. And simplifying the task was accompanied by simplifying the instruction people received. So in the reverse premise variant, the people had only to notice that one response describes the same relation as one of the premises, but in the reversed notation. So to find out that theta is, we use different symbols to check whether the content matters. So this is why I'm presenting various Latin letters, Greek letters, or geometric shapes, but typically we applied each task with all kinds of the material to see whether the material matters or not. It doesn't matter at all. So to learn that theta is smaller than lambda, you only have to find out that in the middle premise, lambda is larger than theta, and reverse the symbols. So the task seemed to be much, much simpler, but it's still correlated with cognitive ability. Okay, so let's go ahead and let the people just identify the same premise among responses. So we used barely abstract instructions. So check two symbols which are in the same order as in the premises. So to learn that lambda is larger than theta, you only have to find a physically identical premise: lambda is larger than theta, but it's still correlated with cognitive ability. So, okay, the hypothesis was perhaps people are scared of mathematical relations like larger than, smaller than. Maybe it is somehow difficult to imagine or process such a relation. So we developed a slashed pair variant where there was a meaningless relation that two letters were connected with the slash, and it mattered the direction of the slash matter. So to respond S/left D, the participant had to find out that there is the same, physically the same S/left D at the upper part of the screen. And the instruction was completely concrete. Just find the same pair with the same slash that looked completely identical. Do you think it correlated with cognitive ability? How do you think?
I'm gonna guess yes.
Yes, because otherwise I wouldn't describing this study. Yes. So in the completely the last chance to get rid of the correlation with cognitive ability, we simply ask to find the same pair of letters at the screen, so as one of the pairs above. So these are the results. When we applied a reduced transitive reasoning task with two premises, it is a typical strong correlation for this task with cognitive ability. When we asked only about reversed premises, the correlation was the same. When we asked about the same relation, just compare two relations, find two identical relations, nothing must be reversed, the correlation is still the same. When we simplified the instruction, okay, the correlation dropped a little bit, but even in the slash pair version variant of the task, the correlation was quite substantial. Only in the task that required comparing just the pair of letters, the correlation disappeared. So we interpreted this result as some evidence that actually it's not a complexity of relation that drives the correlation with working memory cognitive ability, but even representing a single binding between two elements of a structure is crucial. So for our minds, it is demanding to represent validly and in a robust way a trivial, simple binding between two elements. So minds with low ability, with low working memory, are not able to bind two elements in in the univocal way. So either we can only hypothesize but either such a binding disappears from working memory or it messes up. So for example, the direction between of relation between those elements changes, or people substitute one element of relation into another one. But the evidence that such a simple task as /pair still strongly correlate with cognitive ability for us was some evidence that it's not a complexity that matters, but the precision, reliability of a very simple, very trivial representation of relation is important. So now what in the brain, checking time, not to speak too much. So what in the brain can be correlated with processing relations? So if even such simple relations are not easily processed by the brain, what in the brain can be responsible for that? And there is a number of theoretical models of working memory. Maybe I start with such a note. Of course, there are a multitude of neural brain correlates of relation processing, but we focused on one that we think is one of the most promising explanations, and this is frequency of brain rhythms that probably carry out the relational processing. So there is a number of theoretical models of working memory, starting from a seminal model by Lissman and Idiart from early 90s, that they assume that working memory depends very much on slow brain rhythms. So slow brain rhythms with a few hertz. Typically, they mention the theta rhythm are responsible for integrating information when working memory task is processed. And the assumption is that the slower this slow brain rhythm, the more fine-grained representation of information in a working memory can be constructed. Because simply you have more time. So for example, if you compare 5 hertz oscillation with 2 hertz oscillation, in 5 hertz oscillation you have only 200 milliseconds to encode what is happening during one cycle, and there is assumption that one neural cycle integrates the set of elements that is responsible, that is required in a task. So it is better to have 500 milliseconds to encode all those elements when your frequency is 2 hertz than only 200 milliseconds. So there is some evidence that slow rhythms and the systematic activation of information within slow brain rhythms is connected to working memory. The empirical evidence so far was only from animals, but there are 2 recent studies from last 2 years that also showed it in humans. So we adapted this assumption in a computational model of analogy. I won't describe this model because it's quite complicated, but only its feature matters, that it represented the relation. It was the model of the similar geometric task that I showed you. And the crucial feature of this model was that it oscillated all elements of the representation of the relation. They were oscillating, but they were oscillating asynchronously. So they were oscillating, they were active in distinct moments of time. When one transformation, one geometric transformation was active, was peaking, all other transformations should not be active, because otherwise the model would not know which transformation is in play. So using lateral inhibition and some parameters that govern this lateral inhibition, we reached such a stable oscillatory memory. You can see it's I think four oscillating elements. So each element was a geometric feature, like, for example, orientation, and a particular object that this feature was bound with. By manipulating the our parameters, we could generate 100 variants of the model. So 100 simulated participants, which differed in how their oscillatory working memory operated. And we could, in each individual, simulated individual, we could measure or identify the theta cycle and the gamma cycle, what we call it. So we interpreted that each peak of the oscillation of any object is can be interpreted as gamma activity. So when we of course there is no time in model, it's simulated, so it doesn't work physically, but we could interpret the interval between consecutive peaks as a gamma frequency, of course in quotes, because this is only abstract value, and interval between two consecutive peaks of the same binding, of the same oscillation, as the theta cycle. So we could, of course, there is no unit in this. We have no seconds, milliseconds in the model, but we could divide this theta cycle by the gamma cycle, and we would get some ratio telling us how many gamma oscillations could fit into one theta cycle of a given individual model. So you can see the results for 100 models, the percentage of errors they did on analogy tasks, and the greater number of gamma oscillations into one theta cycle of a given model, the smaller number of errors it made. Of course, it's more games than serious science, but it was nice demonstration how it could work. So does it work similarly in the brain? So we did an EEG study on 50 people, trying to identify something that is called phase amplitude coupling, PAC. This is the three small figures on the left show illustrate what phase amplitude coupling is. So strong coupling is when activation in some fast oscillation, some high frequency rhythm is grouped or or condensed in a very specific part of the phase of some slow oscillation. So we assume that slow and fast oscillations are somehow coupled. They are synchronized in a way, but these fast oscillations are active only when there is a given point or given small interval of the slow rhythm. For example, it is more effective from the neurophysiological point of view. It's for many oscillations, it's better to be active in the throw of the slow oscillation, because at that interval, the global negative potential in the brain is larger, it's more negative, so neurons are more sensitive for incoming signals. When this relation between amplitude, fast amplitude and slow phase is less regular, we can say about some moderate PAC, and when there is no relationship, we can say there is weak or no phase amplitude coupling. So what we did, we made people do a couple of relational processing tasks, like this transitive task, and we plotted the values of phase amplitude coupling for all possible frequency combinations. So on x-axis we have frequencies for phase, for slow rhythms, and on the y-axis we have frequency for amplitude of fast. And we found a strong coupling in a cluster around 3 Hertz. So it is quite a slow oscillation. It's the delta band, probably the slowest oscillation in the brain that has some cognitive relevance. But there was no comparable coupling in the theta band. So for faster slow oscillations, because with of course talking about very slow oscillations anyway, but if those very slow oscillations became a little bit faster, up to 7-8 Hertz, the relationship with cognitive ability completely disappeared. So this is correlation with some cognitive ability factor calculated from a number of intelligence and working memory tests, and only for very slow frequency for phase, this correlation is significant. For all other places in this figure, there is no relationship. So in another study that we are currently analyzing, we didn't have time yet to analyze this phase amplitude coupling relationships, but we looked at something even simpler. So people performed Raven advanced progressive matrices test. There are 36 items in this test, and we recorded their EEG activity. And what we did, we looked for a slow brain rhythm whose activity is most strongly correlated with the difficulty of those 36 items. So the assumption is, if items are easy, the brain activity should be low because there is no much thinking needed. But when items are very difficult, the activity should increase because the brain needs more effort to find a solution. So if some frequency correlates very strongly, it's one of the last slides, don't worry. If brain activity correlates with those difficulties of consecutive Raven items, you can say that for this individual, possibly this frequency is responsible for processing relations in the task. And you can see the relationship between consecutive values of frequencies found for number of people and their fluid intelligence factor calculated out of, again, a number of tasks. So people whose brains, of course, it is not a precise statement, but people whose brains solved Raven test at 2 Hz scored around 5 standard deviation above average result. And people in this group, it was 160 people, so not bad. And people whose brains solved Raven test at 6 Hz scored around 0.3 standard deviation below average score. So the last study, very shortly. Okay, so if processing relations is so important for complex cognition, as we assume, perhaps we can somehow capture this process, the efficiency of this process. So Jan Jastrzębski from our team developed, I think, a very clever task to measure efficiency, effectiveness of the very relational structure mapping. What people have to do is to map together 2 mathematically isomorphic graphs, which are different perceptually. They are visually presented differently, but they define the same mathematical structure. So you can see the simplest possible case of the isomorphic graphs. Actually, this is one and the same graph, so it includes one node that has 2 outgoing edges, one node number 2 which has 1 incoming and 1 outgoing edge, and node number 3 which has 3 incoming edges. And when you rotate it or change its presentation in any way, it doesn't change the abstract relation that it describes. So we call it direct mapping because it is the easiest form of mapping between 2 graphs. You can just count the edges and what the types of edges are, and you can find the corresponding nodes. But of course, it would be trivial. So in more complex cases, this is like how the task look like. So on the left side, a graph was presented with 1 node highlighted in yellow and 1 in blue. And on the right side, there was another graph presented without these yellow and blue boxes, so participant didn't see it. All the nodes were black, and they had to point with the mouse which node corresponds to the yellow node and which one corresponds to the blue node. So now you cannot count the edges because both nodes have 1 incoming edge. You have to represent the entire graph. So you have to see that the blue node is connected with the node that has 2 outgoing edges, and the yellow node is connected with the node that has 1 incoming and 1 outgoing edge. But of course, you can complicate the task even more. So you can be very rude to your participants. You can cross the edges. So the perceptual similarity is even lesser and the task is more complex. And of course, you can attack their brains even more with increasing complexity and crossing edges. And these are the results of the task. So with those 3 dimensions, so crossing edges, making mapping direct on or indirect, and increasing number of edges, but you don't need to limit yourself to 5. It can be 7 or 9 as well. You can have any possible values of accuracy from over 80% to lower than 20%. Actually, for 9 nodes, the accuracy is simply random. But what is interesting about this task is that regardless of its simplicity, this task is simply a very good fluid intelligence test. So it correlates with the fluid reasoning factor at the same strength as all other good hallmark fluid reasoning tests correlate. So the correlation of Raven test with fluid reasoning is also 0.75 or something like this, because no test is perfect. Each test has limited reliability. So the ability to map the relational structures predict quite well general intelligence, general cognitive ability, or general cognitive fitness. So we assume that representing relational structures is the key mechanism, not only for analogy, but for perhaps most of kinds of systematic analytic thinking. So quick conclusions. Dedre Gentner was absolutely right that structure mapping is a crucial process for analogy making, but it seems that it's crucial not only for analogy, but to all systematic analytic thinking, which may amount to simply representing a valid structure of relations describing the problem you solved, be it reasoning, problem solving, decision making, or anything. And working with that representation, for example, validating it or comparing with some other representation, like in analogical mapping. And at least in semantically lean situations, relational structures seem to be constructed incrementally, one element but one, and this takes time. And we did a number of studies when we constrained this time, and the results are dramatical. So people no longer are able to build full-blown representations, or they are not able to learn schemas and so on. What may be crucial for all the pattern of correlations with working memory and cognitive ability may be not the available complexity, but just how precise, robust, valid is the brain in representing single bindings between quite trivial elements. And it may be facilitated by using slower rhythms. They may be helpful for maintaining robustness and validity. And of course, it's work in progress. We're trying to use some other methodologies like transcranial alternating current stimulation. Recently, we are about to run a huge experiment with online training of relational ability and so on. So I think these conclusions are now preliminary, and this is rather still more hypothesis than firm results. So thank you very much for attending. This is the team, our team. So if you have any questions, any comments, any criticism, you are very welcome.